Justice. In our time, it means fairness, rights, and protection. But in the medieval world, justice often meant pain. Imagine being dragged into the town square, your neighbors gathering not to defend you, but to watch you scream. Because in their eyes, your suffering was proof of the law. The wheel, the rack, the iron boot. Each was not just punishment, but spectacle. And worse, it was considered righteous. Today, we step back into an age where agony was evidence, where silence under torture was seen as guilt, and where justice was written not with ink, but with blood. The medieval city by dawn was already awake with murmurs of fear. Bells rang not only to call for prayer, but also to summon the crowd for judgment. Streets filled with peasants, merchants, and even children, clutching their mothers' skirts, eager to witness what they believed was divine law in action. The accused would be brought forth, often half naked, chains biting into their wrists. They were not criminals in the way we define them today. Sometimes they were thieves, sometimes accused witches, sometimes simply those who spoke the wrong words against the wrong lord. The line between crime and defiance was razor thin, and once crossed, the machinery of justice turned mercilessly. What is chilling is not only the cruelty of the punishments, but the belief that underpinned them. Pain was seen as purifying. To endure agony was to have your soul tested before God. To confess under torment was to reveal the truth, because surely no liar could withstand the flames, the blades, or the breaking bones of these instruments. The crowd, too, believed themselves part of this holy performance. Watching, jeering, sometimes even throwing stones, they became witnesses to divine order. For them, justice was not silent. It screamed, it bled, it broke bodies until nothing human remained. One of the most infamous devices was the rack, a wooden frame with rollers at each end, ropes tied around wrists and ankles. The executioner would slowly turn the handles, pulling the body apart inch by inch. At first, tendons strained, then joints snapped, muscles tore, and the accused would howl, their screams echoing across the square. To the people, this was proof that justice was being served. The confession that eventually burst from their mouths, whether true or false, was accepted as God's verdict. And if they stayed silent, silence was guilt. Because who could endure such torment unless the devil himself gave them strength? In this paradox, there was no escape. But the rack was just one of many. Another horror was the breaking wheel, a giant wooden wheel on which the condemned was tied. With a hammer or iron bar, the executioner shattered their limbs one by one, weaving the broken body between the spokes. The crowd would watch the victim linger for hours, sometimes days, before death finally came. To us, this is monstrous. To them, it was theater and moral lesson. Parents would even bring their children, pointing to the mangled figure as a warning. See what happens to those who break the law. The philosophy behind this cruelty was simple yet chilling. The law was not about protecting the weak, but about instilling fear. Authority was not proved by fairness, but by the ability to make an example. Every broken limb, every scream, every public display of agony was a reminder that power was absolute, and disobedience would be crushed without mercy. It was not justice as we know it. It was domination, sanctified by religion, legitimized by tradition, and celebrated by the crowd. Trial by ordeal was another twisted form of justice. If accused of theft, heresy, or witchcraft, you might be forced to plunge your hand into boiling water or walk barefoot across glowing iron. If your wounds healed cleanly, it was seen as God declaring you innocent. If they festered, you were guilty. In truth, infection was inevitable. The body burned, nerves destroyed, the pain unbearable. But to the medieval mind, divine judgment had spoken. No evidence, no witnesses. Only the scars of your flesh, interpreted through superstition, became the verdict. And yet, what is most haunting is how normalized this was. Torture was not hidden in dungeons. It was displayed openly, woven into the fabric of civic life. Markets would pause, churches would remain silent. The square became both courtroom and theater, where cruelty wore the mask of righteousness. Imagine the smell, sweat, urine, blood, mixed with the burning pitch of torches. Imagine the sound, a body cracking under pressure, the crowd gasping, priests chanting prayers of absolution for the condemned as they screamed. This was the soundtrack of justice in the Middle Ages. But what makes this even darker is the paradox of belief. To the people, this was not cruelty, it was salvation. For by confessing under torture, the sinner's soul might be saved. By suffering in this life, perhaps they would find forgiveness in the next. The executioner, too, was not seen as a sadist, but as an instrument of divine will. In some towns, he was even respected, feared, but necessary. Without him, the city could not claim order. Without pain, they believed, there was no justice. The question that lingers is this: how could entire societies embrace such horror as fairness? Was it ignorance, faith, fear, or something more disturbing? The human hunger to see suffering, to witness power made flesh. Because behind the cries of justice lay another truth. The spectacle of agony satisfied something primal in the crowd. They did not only fear it, they fed on it. This is the world we enter, a world where justice and cruelty were one and the same, where the whip was a sermon and the breaking of bones was seen as divine truth. A world where innocence or guilt mattered less than the performance of pain. And so, we must ask ourselves, when justice itself is cruel, what becomes of mercy? And when the law is written in blood, what becomes of humanity? The medieval square was never silent. After one execution ended, another accusation soon followed. Justice, in its twisted form, was a performance on repeat. And each act of cruelty demanded new instruments, new stages upon which the law could display its merciless power. If the rack tore bodies apart and the wheel broke bones, there were countless other devices waiting in the dark, each with its own ritual, its own meaning, its own audience. One such invention was the iron boot. At first glance, it seemed almost ordinary, a pair of heavy metal shoes. But once a victim's legs were strapped inside, wedges of wood or metal were hammered down between flesh and steel. With every strike of the mallet, bones splintered, shards pierced muscle, blood seeped into the seams. The screams that followed were not simply cries of agony, they were the music of truth, or so medieval judges believed. For how else could one separate liar from honest man than by watching which bones snapped first? Those who confessed quickly were declared guilty, punished, and sometimes executed. Those who refused suffered longer, until their silence broke or their lives did. To the crowd, it was not murder, it was justice wearing iron. But justice was not always swift. Sometimes it was patient. Sometimes it demanded time, days even, for its truth to emerge. That is where the dungeon became a theater in slow motion. The strappado was one of the most feared methods. A prisoner's arms were tied behind their back, and a rope was fastened to their wrists. The rope was thrown over a beam, and with a sudden jerk, the victim was hoisted into the air, suspended by twisted shoulders. At first, sockets dislocated, then muscles tore. And if the executioner wanted more, weights were tied to the ankles, dragging the body downward, ripping arms from their sockets. It was not always fatal, but perhaps that was the point. Death would have been merciful. Survival meant the pain itself was the verdict. Inquisitors loved the strappado. It was silent, required no blood, and left little evidence for the outside world. A body could be displayed later, bruised but intact, as if divine judgment had spoken through invisible hands. Confessions obtained this way were written down, sealed, and declared holy truth. To question them was to question God's justice. And so, the victim's voice, broken by screams, became the word of law. Yet not all devices were hidden in chambers. Some were monstrous in their symbolism. The Iron Maiden, for instance, became one of the most infamous icons of medieval cruelty. A tall coffin of iron, lined inside with spikes. The victim was placed within, the door slowly closed, spikes piercing flesh, but not so deeply as to kill immediately. Instead, wounds bled slowly. Agony stretched across hours, sometimes days. Though historians still debate whether the Iron Maiden was used as much as legend claims, in the medieval imagination, it became the perfect metaphor, a false embrace of justice, a motherly shape that promised sanctuary but delivered only death. The crowd whispered of it with horror and fascination. And whether real or exaggerated, the image of the Iron Maiden has haunted our collective memory as the face of medieval law. But perhaps the most grotesque aspect of medieval justice was not the devices themselves. It was the acceptance. Torture was not carried out in shadows. It was sanctioned, documented, even celebrated. Municipal records detailed the costs of maintaining racks and wheels. Guilds of executioners passed down knowledge like any other trade. Priests blessed the punishments, declaring them trials of the soul. And the people. They watched, they nodded, they believed. For them, cruelty was not barbarity, it was order. Without it, they feared chaos, heresy, rebellion. In their eyes, every scream kept the world safe. We cannot overlook the psychological theater. The public square was not only a place of punishment, but also of deterrence. Imagine standing in the crowd, a child clutching your hand, as a thief's body was broken before your eyes. The lesson was clear: obey or suffer. This was how kingdoms maintained power, how lords preserved obedience, how the church ensured faith. Fear was the currency, pain the transaction, and justice the name they gave to it. Consider the case of suspected witches. Women, sometimes midwives, sometimes widows, sometimes simply disliked, were dragged before tribunals. They were stripped, searched for the mark of the devil, and if none was found, torture supplied it. The thumbscrew was one of the cruelest tools here, a device that crushed fingers or toes between iron plates, slowly pulping flesh and bone. With each turn of the screw, the accused was expected to speak, to name accomplices, to confess to flying at night, to admit to consorting with demons. Silence was impossible. The pain demanded words, any words, true or false. And those words, written down, became evidence enough to burn a woman alive. Do you see the paradox? Torture was meant to find truth, yet it created lies. People confessed to anything if it meant ending the agony. They accused neighbors, friends, even their own kin. And still, the crowd accepted these falsehoods as God's verdict. Justice was not about fact, it was about fear, and fear was enough. The cruelty of medieval justice lingers because it exposes something we do not want to admit: that society can dress violence in robes of morality, that the breaking of bones can be sanctified as holy law, that entire communities, from priests to peasants, can gather not to mourn a victim, but to cheer their suffering. It is easy to condemn them as ignorant, but what if they were simply human? What if the hunger for control, the thirst for spectacle, the comfort of believing that suffering equals truth, is something that has never left us? In the silence after the screams, when the crowd dispersed and the square returned to commerce, life continued as if nothing monstrous had happened. Bread was sold, sermons were preached, children played, and yet, beneath the cobblestones, blood had seeped, bones had broken, voices had ended. That was justice. That was order. That was the world of the Middle Ages. And now, centuries later, we must confront the haunting echo. If pain was once seen as justice, then what do we see today as righteous, which future generations will call cruelty? In the medieval world, the line between justice and superstition was paper thin. Where evidence failed and witnesses were few, men and women were cast into the hands of God Himself. It was called the trial by ordeal, a ritual in which pain and danger decided innocence, where the body became the courtroom and scars became the verdict. To the medieval mind, human judgment was flawed, but divine fire, boiling water, or freezing rivers could never lie. If you survived, you were pure. If you burned, bled, or drowned, your guilt was confirmed. And so, once again, justice was written not in reason, but in agony. Picture a village gathered at the churchyard, bells tolling, priests chanting psalms. An accused man, trembling, stands barefoot on the cold earth. Before him, a cauldron of water boils, steam hissing into the morning air. This is the ordeal of hot water. He is commanded to plunge his arm into the scalding depths and retrieve a stone placed at the bottom. Before the crowd, he obeys, thrusting his hand into liquid fire. Skin blisters instantly, flesh peels away, the stench of burning fills the square. He screams but clutches the stone, pulling it forth for all to see. The crowd gasps. The priest steps forward, wraps the wound, and declares, "In 3 days we shall inspect the burn. If the wound heals cleanly, God has spoken. He is innocent. If it festers, if pus or rot sets in, he is guilty and condemned." In truth, the result was almost certain. In an age without medicine, burns festered. Few ever passed the ordeal unscathed, yet the people believed, and belief was enough. There was also the ordeal of hot iron. Here, the accused was made to carry a bar of glowing metal, sometimes 9 feet, sometimes just a few paces, depending on the crime. Hands scorched, flesh sizzled, the accused stumbled forward while the crowd prayed or jeered. Afterward, the hands were bound, and again, the wound became the verdict. Clean healing meant innocence. Festering meant guilt. What is most chilling is the solemnity of it all. The priests chanting blessings over the iron, the sacred atmosphere that cloaked cruelty and divine ritual. For them, it was not barbarity, it was holy trial. Perhaps the most infamous of all was the ordeal by water. A man accused of witchcraft or heresy would be bound hand and foot, then cast into a river or pond. If he floated, it meant the water, God's pure element, had rejected him, proving his guilt. If he sank, he was innocent, though often drowned before rescue. The cruel paradox is inescapable. Survival meant death at the stake, drowning meant death by water, and either way, the accused was doomed. Women accused of witchcraft especially feared this ordeal, for whispers of witches floating like wood filled the imagination of medieval villagers. The sight of a bound woman thrashing in icy water, gasping for breath, became both entertainment and confirmation. The crowd did not see murder, they saw God's judgment. There was yet another form, the ordeal by combat. Here, disputes were settled not by evidence or reason, but by bloodshed. Two men fought, sometimes to first blood, sometimes to the death, armed with swords, clubs, or even bare fists. The victor was declared righteous, for surely God would not allow the guilty to win. But what if one man was stronger, better trained, younger? What if chance alone turned the tide? None of that mattered. Victory was innocence, defeat was guilt. In this way, brute force wore the mask of divine will. Lords and peasants alike accepted it, for it gave them a spectacle to believe in. The cruel irony of the trial by ordeal lies not just in the pain, but in the faith surrounding it. Priests stood by, blessing the rituals, assuring the people that God's hand guided fire and water. Communities gathered not in horror, but in solemnity, as if witnessing a sacred truth. Parents brought their children to watch, so they would learn that no sin escaped divine eyes. And the accused, terrified, trembling, often accepted the ordeal themselves, believing that if they were truly innocent, God would spare them. But God was silent. Flesh burned, lungs filled with water, bones broke, and the silence of heaven was taken as proof of guilt. Consider one haunting story recorded in chronicles of 13th century Germany. A miller, accused of theft, was ordered to undergo the ordeal of hot water. Before the village, he plunged his arm into the cauldron, seized the stone, and pulled it out. His hand blistered, raw and swollen. 3 days later, when priests unwrapped the bandages, infection had set in. The wound was black, oozing. Guilty, they declared, and the miller was executed. Yet, what theft had he committed? None could prove. It mattered little. The wound had spoken louder than any words. Or think of women in the witch trials, cast into rivers across Europe. Some sank, never to rise, dying innocent deaths swallowed by cold water. Others floated by sheer panic and struggle, condemned as witches and dragged to the stake. The crowd believed they had witnessed justice, but in truth, they had only seen fear, survival instinct, and tragedy dressed as divine law. What is most terrifying is not that these ordeals existed, but that they were accepted for centuries. No one questioned their logic because questioning meant questioning God. And to question God was heresy, a crime often punished by the very ordeals in question. It was a circle with no escape. Pain proved guilt, and guilt justified pain. The trial by ordeal shows us a medieval truth we must not forget, that justice, when fused with blind faith and fear, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. When reason is abandoned, when the crowd hungers for certainty more than truth, even boiling water and drowning ponds can wear the mask of righteousness. And so, centuries later, the question lingers in the silence of history. Did they believe so blindly because they were devout, or because they were afraid? Did they seek God's truth, or simply an excuse to watch another human suffer? If the medieval square was a theater of justice for the masses, then the church was its playwright. For in the Middle Ages, law was not merely human, it was divine. And nowhere was this fusion of faith and cruelty more evident than in the chambers of the Inquisition. Behind the thick stone walls of monasteries and cathedrals, holy men turned judges, and torture was sanctified as a weapon against heresy, the greatest crime of all. For to question God, or worse, to question the Church's authority, was to unravel the very fabric of society. And so, pain became holy, suffering became sacred, and screams became prayers rising to heaven. The Inquisition began in the 12th century, a system forged by the Catholic Church to hunt out heretics, those who denied official doctrine, those who whispered against priests, those who dared to read forbidden texts. But unlike secular courts which punish theft or murder, the Inquisition hunted the soul. Heresy was invisible, hidden in thought, carried in whispers, spread like disease. And because it could not be seen, it had to be revealed. Torture was the needle that drew it out. The Church declared it not only lawful, but necessary. After all, what was a little earthly agony compared to eternal damnation? If a confession saved a soul from hell, then the breaking of bones was, in their eyes, an act of mercy. Inside the chambers of the Inquisition, the tools of justice lay neatly arranged like surgical instruments. The strappado, already infamous, became standard. Accused heretics were hoisted by their bound wrists until shoulders tore from their sockets. Priests stood by, not as sadists but as overseers of the soul, urging confession, offering absolution if only the accused would speak. For those who resisted, other devices awaited. The rack stretched bodies until joints snapped. The thumbscrew crushed fingers until bones turned to pulp. Hot irons pressed against skin, branding flesh with crosses as if to mark the sinner for judgment. Yet it was not only the pain that made the Inquisition terrifying, it was the ritual. Each session began with prayers, blessings, invocations of Christ. Torture was framed as a holy duty, the executioner as an instrument of divine justice. Inquisitors often assured their victims that this was for their salvation, that confession under torment would cleanse the soul. To resist was to defy not man, but God. In this way, the Church cloaked cruelty in the robes of holiness, turning dungeons into sanctuaries of pain. The paradox is almost unbearable. Men who preached mercy, who spoke of Christ's compassion, sanctioned horrors that shattered bodies and minds. They believed they were guardians of the faith, protectors of truth, defenders of God's kingdom. But in reality, they became engineers of fear. Towns and villages trembled at the mere whisper of heresy, for all knew what awaited those accused. To be summoned by the Inquisition was to step into a labyrinth with no way out. Once inside, even silence condemned you. And silence was common, for what could one say against an accusation so vague, so intangible? You doubt the Church. You spread false teaching. You consorted with demons. How could anyone prove otherwise? Words failed. Evidence meant nothing, and so the body became the battleground. Torture forced words from mouths, true or false, and those words were written as testimony. Once written, they could not be undone. A confession wrung from screams was treated as divine revelation. In this way, the Inquisition manufactured truth, sanctified by blood and ink. The reach of the Inquisition was vast. From France to Spain to Italy, its agents prowled, rooting out dissent. The Spanish Inquisition in particular became infamous for its brutal efficiency. Jews who had converted to Christianity were scrutinized, accused of secretly practicing their old faith. Conversos, they were called, and thousands were dragged before inquisitors. Torture chambers filled with their cries, and pyres lit the night skies as justice was carried out. Entire families perished, not because of crimes, but because of belief, or even suspicion. And the crowd once again gathered to watch. Yet perhaps the most chilling part was not the cruelty itself, but the orderliness. Records of the Inquisition still exist, meticulous as any clerk's ledger. Names of the accused, methods of torture used, confessions recorded line by line. It was not chaos, it was bureaucracy. Suffering was cataloged, systematized, justified. Pain became paperwork, filed neatly in archives of the Holy Court. Justice was not wild brutality. It was organized, deliberate, efficient. To step into those records is to hear echoes of the dungeon. One testimony speaks of a man accused of heresy who endured the rack until his body was nearly torn apart. He confessed to everything, consorting with demons, mocking the sacraments, even crimes impossible for him to commit. The inquisitors recorded it faithfully, then passed sentence. The man was burned at the stake, his soul, they claimed, cleansed in the fire. Another tells of a woman accused of witchcraft. The thumbscrew crushed her hands until she cried out that she had flown with the devil at night. Her testimony was accepted as fact, her body as proof, her ashes as triumph. And what of the people outside those stone walls? They whispered, they feared, they obeyed. None dared question, for to question was to invite suspicion. And so, silence reigned. The church's power was absolute, not because of faith alone, but because of fear woven into every scream that echoed from the dungeons. Justice in this world was not a shield. It was a sword wielded by men in robes. The Inquisition teaches us something unsettling, that cruelty does not always come dressed as barbarism. Sometimes it comes wrapped in rituals, cloaked in prayer, justified by salvation. That is what makes it enduring. For centuries, people accepted it not because they were monsters, but because they believed it was holy. And when cruelty wears the mask of holiness, who dares to call it wrong? As we leave the chambers of the Inquisition, one question lingers like smoke after a burning pyre. Did they believe in their own righteousness, or did they simply hide behind it? Were they men of God seeking truth, or men of power seeking control? Perhaps the two are indistinguishable, and that is the true horror. If the Inquisition made torture sacred in the chambers of stone, then the marketplace made it a spectacle. The crowd was not a passive observer in medieval justice. They were an active participant. Without them, the theater of punishment lost its power. For it was not enough that a man be broken in the dark. He had to be broken in the open, where eyes could see, ears could hear, and mouths could spread the tale like wildfire through villages and towns. Justice, in the Middle Ages, was a communal performance, and the crowd was both jury and audience, both witness and accomplice. On the morning of an execution, bells rang not for prayer, but for punishment. Streets swelled with people, peasants abandoning fields, merchants leaving their stalls, mothers carrying children. Some came out of duty, believing it necessary to see justice done. Others came out of fear, wanting to assure themselves that the law was real and merciless. And many came simply out of hunger for spectacle. For in a world with little entertainment beyond the church, the tavern, and the fair, the agony of others became the theater of the poor. Picture the square at noon. A platform stands in the center, the rack or wheel already prepared. Vendors move among the crowd, selling bread, ale, roasted chestnuts. Children weave between legs, laughing, until the condemned is brought forth in chains. Then the air changes. Silence spreads like frost. All eyes fix on the trembling figure. The executioner steps forward, masked or hooded, sometimes even revered as a strange kind of celebrity. Priests chant blessings, reminding the crowd that this cruelty is holy, that every bone broken is a sermon in flesh. And then, with the first scream, silence shatters. The crowd leans forward, gasps, murmurs, sometimes cheers. Why did they watch? Why did they bring their children? Because to them, this was not barbarity. It was order. To see a thief stretched on the rack, to see a witch drowned or burned, was to feel that the world still had boundaries, that chaos was held at bay. In their minds, the more painful the punishment, the more secure their lives. The spectacle was reassurance. And yet, beneath the prayers and solemn words, something darker stirred. The thrill of watching another human suffer. The forbidden satisfaction of seeing flesh torn, of hearing agony echo against stone walls. Accounts from the time reveal the strange carnival-like atmosphere of these events. In some towns, executions were timed with festivals, drawing crowds from miles away. Traders set up stalls, musicians played, jugglers performed, all while the condemned awaited their fate. It was justice wrapped in festivity, cruelty disguised as celebration. Parents pointed to the condemned, telling their children, "See what happens to sinners." Yet those same children grew up remembering the laughter, the smells of roasted meat, the thrill of watching punishment. Justice was not only fear, it was entertainment. And there were moments when the crowd went further, when they demanded more than the law required. If an execution was too quick, too merciful, they jeered. They wanted a show. They wanted to see blood. They wanted to see bodies break slowly, to savor the process of justice as performance. Chronicles tell of mobs that attacked condemned prisoners before execution, hurling stones, spitting, tearing at their clothes. Justice became mob violence, sanctioned by the law. The boundary between authority and bloodlust blurred until both became the same. Consider the case of a thief in 14th century Paris. He was sentenced to hanging, but when the noose tightened too quickly and his body went limp in seconds, the crowd grew restless. They demanded more. The executioner was forced to cut him down and revive him with water, only to hang him again, this time more slowly. The people cheered, satisfied that justice had been properly drawn out. To them, mercy was weakness, and weakness threatened order. Or consider the witch trials of Germany and Switzerland, where women accused of consorting with demons were burned alive. People traveled for miles to witness the flames. Accounts speak of laughter mixed with prayers, of villagers dipping cloths into the ashes to keep as talismans. The crowd turned agony into relics, suffering into souvenirs. They did not see horror, they saw righteousness. And yet, behind their chants, one wonders how many felt a thrill they could not name, a dark joy in watching another perish. This is the paradox of the medieval crowd. They were both terrified and entertained. They feared the law, but they also loved its spectacle. They believed in divine justice, but they also hungered for blood. And in their participation, they gave legitimacy to cruelty. For what ruler, what priest, what inquisitor could wield torture if the people themselves did not watch, did not approve, did not believe? Justice in the Middle Ages was not imposed from above alone. It was sustained from below, nourished by the eyes and voices of the masses. Psychologists today might call it collective catharsis. By watching others suffer, people purged their own fears, reassured themselves of their own safety. It is not me on the wheel. It is not my hand in the cauldron. Every scream was a reminder that obedience kept them safe, that silence preserved their place in the crowd rather than on the scaffold. And so they returned home, their bellies full, their hearts strangely light, telling the tale to neighbors who had not attended. I saw justice today. It was terrible. It was holy. But in truth, what they saw was not justice. It was cruelty disguised as order. And what they felt was not righteousness. It was fascination with pain. The crowd was not only witness, they were accomplice. They normalized torture by turning it into tradition. They handed it down like a story, a ritual, a memory etched into culture. And in doing so, they kept the wheel turning, the rack stretching, the fire burning. As the crowd dispersed, life resumed. Merchants reopened stalls, children played again, priests returned to their prayers. But the echoes of the screams lingered in the square, seeping into the cobblestones. And those echoes remind us that justice is never only about law, it is about people, what they accept, what they cheer, what they believe. And so, centuries later, we must ask, did the medieval crowd truly believe they were watching justice? Or did they simply find comfort in cruelty, dressed in the language of God? Perhaps the two were one and the same. And perhaps, disturbingly, they still are. If the crowd was the audience of medieval justice, and the church its author, then the executioner was the actor, the one who made the script of cruelty real. Without him, the rack was silent wood, the wheel only an idle circle, the fire only cold ash. It was his hands that turned the gears, swung the hammers, tightened the ropes. It was his face, often hidden beneath a hood, that the condemned saw in their final moments. And yet, for all his power, he lived a life both cursed and necessary. The executioner was both despised and indispensable, feared as a butcher, yet tolerated as a guardian of order. In many medieval towns, the role of executioner was inherited, passed from father to son like a grotesque family trade. Few volunteered for the position, for to wield the axe or tighten the screws meant to carry the stigma of death. Whole families of executioners were shunned, forced to live outside city walls, forbidden to mingle with respectable society. People spat at them in the marketplace, whispered that their souls were damned, that their touch was polluted. And yet, when the bells tolled and justice demanded blood, the same people crowded to watch them work, praying that their hand would not falter. The paradox is almost unbearable. Hated in life, necessary in duty. Executioners carried a burden unlike any other. They were artisans of agony, skilled in the precise application of pain. Too quick, and the crowd jeered, feeling cheated of justice. Too slow, and they risked angering both rulers and mob. Their work demanded a balance, just enough suffering to prove guilt, but not so much chaos as to lose control. Some became notorious for their efficiency, able to behead a man with a single clean stroke. Others gained infamy for their cruelty, stretching out torments, turning punishment into prolonged theater. In both cases, they embodied justice in flesh and steel, and yet their humanity lingered. Chronicles tell of executioners who drank heavily before their duties, drowning conscience in ale. Others prayed, whispering pleas for forgiveness before wielding their blades. Some grew numb, their eyes hollow, their souls dulled by repetition. But others, disturbingly, thrived in it, relishing the power, the screams, the fear. For when society hands you the mask of cruelty, some will wear it too well. One chilling account comes from 16th century Germany, where an executioner named Meister Franz kept a detailed journal of his work. He recorded each punishment, whippings, beheadings, burnings, with calm precision, as though writing an accountant's ledger. He noted how long a victim survived on the wheel, how cleanly a blade severed a neck, how loudly a crowd cheered. To read his words today is to hear the cold heartbeat of justice made mechanical. He did not question. He did not repent. He did only what society demanded, and society rewarded him with both coin and curse. For make no mistake, executioners were paid. Municipal records show stipends for maintaining torture devices, fees for each execution, even extra payment if the condemned resisted. Some towns granted executioners the right to take certain possessions of the dead as part of their wages. But wealth could not erase stigma. They lived apart, married only within their own families or into outcast groups, marked forever by the profession that both fed and damned them. Their children inherited not only trade, but exile. Entire bloodlines were stained with the shadow of the axe. Yet, paradoxically, when plague struck, when riots threatened, when lawlessness loomed, it was often the executioner who was called upon. He alone could handle corpses, dispose of the dead, wield authority in chaos. In those moments, the people looked to him not with disgust, but with desperate respect. He was their shield, their necessary evil, for in a world built on fear, who better to enforce it than the man who dealt in death? There is something profoundly disturbing about this duality. The executioner was both outcast and central figure, despised yet essential. He lived at the margins, yet his presence was woven into the very fabric of justice. His hood, his axe, his rope. These were symbols every child knew, reminders that law was not parchment or words, but flesh torn and blood spilled. He was the embodiment of authority's cruelty, walking among men yet set apart from them. And what of the condemned, staring into the eyes of their tormentor? Did they see a monster, a sadist, a demon cloaked in human form? Or did they see a man like themselves, broken, trapped, enslaved by a role society forced upon him? Perhaps both. For the hood did not only hide the executioner's identity, it hid his humanity. To the crowd, he was faceless justice. To himself, he was a man drowning in contradictions. The executioner reminds us of an unsettling truth. Cruelty is never abstract. It is enacted by hands, carried out by human beings. Behind every torture device was someone turning the wheel. Behind every scream was someone tightening the rope. And those men were not demons from another world. They were sons, fathers, neighbors. They laughed, they wept, they ate, they prayed. And yet, when duty called, they became instruments of horror. Perhaps the darkest irony is this. The executioner, despised in life, often found strange redemption in death. Some towns buried them in unmarked graves, shunning their memory. Others, however, honored them as servants of order, guardians against chaos. Their bones, like their lives, bore the weight of society's contradictions, hated yet relied upon. So, when we think of medieval justice, we must not only see the victims or the rulers, we must also see the man with the hood, standing at the center of the stage, both prisoner and master of his role, for without him, the spectacle could not exist. And in his silence, we hear the echo of every society that demands cruelty, but hides the hands that deliver it. And so, the question lingers, heavy as the executioner's axe. When cruelty is necessary for order, who is truly guilty? The man who wields the blade, or the society that places it in his hands? When we speak of torture in the Middle Ages, it is easy to drift into abstraction. Devices, rituals, crowds. But behind every rack and wheel, there was a body. Behind every scream, there was a name. These were not faceless figures lost in history. They were sons, daughters, mothers, wanderers, farmers, priests. Ordinary lives crushed beneath extraordinary cruelty. To understand medieval justice, we must walk into their stories, into the final hours of those who became examples for others. One such story comes from 15th century France, where a young woman named Marguerite was accused of witchcraft. She was a healer, known in her village for using herbs to treat fevers, for whispering charms to ease childbirth. But whispers soon became accusations. A child died, and tongues wagged. Surely she had cursed him. A cow fell ill, and neighbors murmured, Surely she had poisoned it. Fear bloomed like weeds, and in time, she was dragged before the tribunal. She denied the charges, she wept. But denial meant little. To the judges, her skills with herbs were proof enough. She was taken to the chamber, her hands bound, her body strapped to the rack. The rope pulled. At first her joints strained, the cords cutting deep into her flesh. Then her shoulders tore from their sockets. She screamed, words tumbling out, confessing to flying at night, to consorting with devils, to crimes she had never imagined. Anything to make the pain stop. Her words were written down as truth, her body declared guilty. Days later, she was burned in the square. The crowd watched flames consume her, mothers telling their daughters, "This is what happens to witches." Her healing hands turned to ash, her screams swallowed by fire. This was justice. Another tale echoes from England in the 14th century. A man named Thomas, a miller by trade, was accused of stealing grain from his lord's storehouse. Theft, in that age, was not merely a crime, it was rebellion against the order of society. He was brought before the court, denied the charges, pleaded his innocence. But the evidence was thin, and so the ordeal was ordered. Thomas was bound, his hands tied, and lowered into the village pond. If he sank, God would prove his innocence. If he floated, his guilt would be plain. The crowd gathered, their breath frosting in the cold air. The rope cut into his flesh as he thrashed in the icy water, lungs burning, desperate for breath. He sank once, twice, but his body, bound and frantic, floated back up. Cries rang out, "Witch! Thief! Guilty!" He was dragged from the water, coughing, and within days, hanged. His family watched, helpless. His children grew up fatherless, branded as the offspring of a criminal. The pond remained silent, as if mocking the justice that had drowned him. The cruelty of medieval justice is most stark in the story of those who remained silent. In Spain, during the Inquisition, a man named Diego was accused of heresy. He was said to have mocked the sacraments in secret, to have spoken ill of priests. He denied it fiercely, clinging to his faith. But the inquisitors demanded confession. He was subjected to the strappado, hoisted by his arms until his shoulders dislocated, his body dangling like a broken doll. Still he refused to speak. They added weights to his ankles, tearing muscles, snapping tendons. His lips remained sealed, his silence unbroken. To the church, this was proof of guilt, for who but the guilty could resist confession under such torment? And so, Diego was condemned, burned alive before the eyes of his community. His silence, meant as dignity, was twisted into guilt. His ashes were carried by the wind, his faith erased by fire. Perhaps most haunting are the nameless victims, the countless peasants whose stories were never recorded. The woman accused by a jealous neighbor, the boy blamed for a poor harvest, the beggar too strange, too silent, too different. They were dragged from huts, chained, broken, silenced. Their lives forgotten, their screams fading into the chorus of 1,000 others. Yet for each of them, the pain was real, the fear absolute, the injustice complete. The victims remind us that medieval justice was not blind. It was selective, cruelly pragmatic. The poor were far more likely to face torture, for they had no wealth to bribe judges, no influence to sway courts. The marginalized, the healers, the wanderers, the strangers became easy targets. Power protected itself. Weakness fed the wheel, and the crowd accepted it, for to question meant to risk joining them on the scaffold. To imagine these victims is to shatter the myth of the Middle Ages as distant, unreal. They were human as we are, with loves, fears, dreams. Marguerite, the healer, may have dreamed of nothing more than a quiet life, tending her garden. Thomas, the miller, may have hoped to feed his family through honest work. Diego, the accused heretic, may have wished only to worship in peace, but justice devoured them. Their names became curses, their deaths became warnings, their humanity erased beneath the weight of spectacle. And yet, in their silence, in their ashes, in their forgotten graves, we hear the echo of truth, that justice without mercy is only cruelty, that law without reason is only tyranny. The victims of medieval torture remind us that behind every system of power are the broken bodies of those it consumes. And the most haunting question of all, if we had lived then, would we have been the condemned or the ones watching? When we imagine medieval torture, our minds often turn to the infamous. the rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden. But the truth is far darker. The Middle Ages produced not only brutality, but creativity, an endless ingenuity in the art of pain. Each town, each tribunal seemed to invent its own devices, its own rituals, as though cruelty itself was an evolving craft. And behind every invention lay the same justification. This is justice, this is truth, this is the will of God. Among the strangest instruments was the Judas cradle, a device designed not for quick execution, but for prolonged humiliation. The condemned was stripped and hoisted above a pyramid-shaped seat, its sharp point aimed at the most vulnerable part of the body. Slowly, with ropes and pulleys, they were lowered onto the point. The weight of their own body drove the spike deeper, hour by hour, day by day. Infection set in, agony became endless, but death came only after long torment. To the medieval judge, this was ideal. The victim's scream stretched across days, a living sermon against sin, and the people believed. Then there was the pear of anguish, a deceptively small device, shaped like a metal fruit with petals. Inserted into the mouth, or worse, into other orifices, the pear was slowly twisted open by a screw, tearing flesh from within. It left little outward mark, making it perfect for extracting confessions unseen. Victims howled as jaws broke, throats tore, bodies ruptured. To the inquisitors, it was not sadism, but science, an efficient way to force the soul's secrets into the open. They called it a tool of truth. In reality, it was a flower of iron blooming in darkness. Even more grotesque was the Spanish chair, an instrument of both restraint and agony. The condemned was strapped naked to a chair, lined with hundreds of sharp spikes. Any movement pierced skin. Sometimes heated irons were placed beneath the chair, warming the spikes until they seared flesh. The victims' screams filled the chamber, their body pierced and burned, yet still alive. To the authorities, this was not barbarity, it was method. Each scream a syllable of confession, each drop of blood a signature of guilt. The iron collar was another cruel creation. A ring of metal, studded with inward-facing spikes, was locked around the victim's neck. Any movement, any nod, any turn, drove the spikes deeper into flesh. Some collars were left on for days, even weeks, forcing the condemned to sleep upright, choking on their own pain. The lesson was clear. Guilt is not only punished, it is worn, carried, lived. To see a man stumble through the streets with such a collar was to see justice walking before your eyes. But perhaps the most disturbing were the methods that required no elaborate devices, only imagination. The ordeal of water torture, for instance, in which victims were forced to swallow endless amounts of water until their stomachs swelled, threatening to burst. Or the sleep deprivation chambers, where prisoners were denied rest for days, kept awake by cold, noise, or constant prodding, their minds unraveling long before their bodies broke. Madness itself became proof of guilt. Other punishments blurred the line between torture and mockery. In some towns, accused criminals were placed in the pillory or the stocks, devices that immobilized the body in the square, leaving the victim exposed for hours or days. The crowd hurled rotten food, stones, insults. Though less bloody than the rack or wheel, the psychological torment was immense. Shame was as sharp as iron, and humiliation as binding as chains. To the people, this too was justice, public, communal, undeniable. We cannot ignore the sheer ingenuity of these inventions. Each one was tailored not merely to cause pain, but to create meaning. The Judas cradle symbolized impurity. The pear of anguish forced truth from the mouth. The iron collar made guilt visible. The chair punished disobedience by turning the body itself into a prison. Torture was not random. It was symbolic, theatrical, almost artistic in its cruelty. And that is what makes it so haunting. Consider what it means that entire communities, even whole kingdoms, invested time and resources into creating such devices. Blacksmiths forged them, judges commissioned them, priests blessed them, executioners mastered their use. Society itself became the engineer of pain, and all of it was cloaked in the name of law, morality, faith. But the creativity of torture also reveals something more unsettling. The human imagination is not limited to beauty, to art, to invention for good. It can just as easily be turned to cruelty, to the refinement of suffering. The Middle Ages remind us that ingenuity is neutral, that progress in design can serve darkness as easily as light. A chair can comfort or kill, a screw can build or destroy. And perhaps the most terrifying question is this: how different are we today? Have we truly abandoned such inventions, or have we merely hidden them behind new words, new rituals, new justifications? The Judas cradle, the pear of anguish, the iron collar, these haunt us not only because they were used, but because they reveal what humans are capable of creating when cruelty is given a purpose. So, when we gaze upon these strange devices in museums, cold and rusted, we must not see them as relics of a barbaric past. We must see them as mirrors, for they show us that justice, once unmoored from mercy, can twist imagination into horror. And in their iron teeth, in their cruel geometry, we glimpse the truth. Pain itself was once considered righteousness. The screams of the tortured did not end when the ropes loosened or the fires died. They lingered, seeping into the stones of castles, the timbers of dungeons, the very soil of marketplaces where blood once dripped. Medieval torture left scars not only on bodies, but on the collective soul of Europe. And these scars, though centuries old, still whisper beneath the surface of history. For the victims, survival was rarely salvation. Those who endured the rack or strappado carried broken limbs, twisted spines, and ruined hands for the rest of their lives. They were living reminders of cruelty, walking testaments to justice. A man once accused of theft might be released, but his mangled body ensured he could never work again. A woman accused of witchcraft might escape death, but her scarred flesh marked her as guilty in the eyes of neighbors forever. Torture destroyed not only the moment of trial, but the entire future of its victims. To survive was to be exiled in plain sight. Families, too, bore the wounds. The wife of a condemned man carried his shame, his children inherited his stigma. Villages whispered about the heretic's daughter, or the thief's son, ensuring that guilt spread beyond the individual into generations. Justice did not stop at the scaffold. It seeped into homes, poisoning names, erasing lineages. Many fled, disappearing into anonymity, their stories dissolved into silence. The invisible torture was memory, carried like a brand on the soul. But perhaps the deepest scars were carved into the collective mind of the people. When cruelty is public, it teaches. When torture is spectacle, it normalizes fear. Generations of children grew up watching bodies broken, flesh burned, bones shattered. They absorbed the lesson that law is pain, that obedience is survival. They learned not to question, not to speak, not to defy. Silence became a virtue, compliance a religion. And so, torture shaped not just justice but culture itself. This collective trauma hardened society. Compassion shrank, suspicion grew. Neighbors betrayed neighbors, families denounced each other, all to avoid suspicion themselves. The Inquisition thrived not only because of its power, but because people, terrified, became its accomplices. Torture turned communities inward, sowing mistrust like seeds. Where once there might have been solidarity, there was silence, fear, and betrayal. The echo of the dungeon lived in every whisper, every furtive glance. The church, too, carried the weight of these scars. Though it cloaked torture in prayers and rituals, its reputation was forever stained. Centuries later, when the Enlightenment dawned, thinkers looked back on these practices with horror, denouncing them as hypocrisy. Cruelty masquerading as faith. The very institution that preached mercy had sanctioned unspeakable pain. And though the church survived, the memory of its iron grip haunted Europe, fueling skepticism, rebellion, and reform. Even the architecture bore witness. Visit the dungeons beneath medieval castles, and you will find hooks in the ceilings, grooves worn into stone from chains, scorch marks blackening walls. These were not accidents. They were deliberate, functional scars etched into the very bones of buildings. And though tourists now walk through them with curiosity, the walls remember. They have absorbed centuries of human agony, and their silence is heavier than words. The legacy of torture also reshaped law. When the Enlightenment challenged cruelty, new systems of justice emerged, emphasizing evidence, reason, and rights. But these reforms were born from horror, from the recognition of what happens when law becomes pain. Modern courts, with their insistence on due process and presumption of innocence, are built on the graves of medieval victims. Their screams are woven into our demand for fairness today, their ashes fertilizing the soil from which justice grew anew. And yet, the shadow lingers. Modern societies may not stretch bodies on racks or burn witches in squares, but echoes of medieval cruelty remain. Public humiliation has not vanished. It has simply moved online, where digital mobs jeer instead of throwing stones. Torture has not disappeared. It has changed its name, hidden behind words like enhanced interrogation. The same justification is whispered. It is necessary. It keeps us safe. It reveals truth. And in those whispers, the medieval past stirs. What makes these echoes haunting is not only that they persist, but that they remind us of the fragility of mercy. Civilization is a thin veil. Beneath it lies the same hunger for order through pain, the same temptation to cloak cruelty in righteousness. The Middle Ages were not unique in this. They were simply honest, brutal, unashamed. They displayed cruelty openly, where we now hide it in shadows. But the impulse is the same. So, the scars of medieval torture are not only in ruins, in records, in whispered legends. They are in us, in our fear of authority, in our acceptance of cruelty when cloaked in law, in our fascination with violence as spectacle. The crowd that cheered a man's bones breaking is not gone. It has only changed form. And until we confront that echo, we risk repeating the cycle. For history does not forget. The stones remember, the blood remembers. And if we close our ears, we may not hear the screams, but they are still there, vibrating beneath the earth, waiting to remind us that once, not so long ago, justice itself was agony. The Middle Ages have ended, but their shadows remain. When we look back on racks and wheels, on boiling water and iron boots, it is easy to feel distance. Those were barbaric times, cruel centuries, a world alien to our own. And yet, when the echoes are stripped bare, the truth is harder to face. What the medieval world reveals is not only its darkness, but ours. For torture as justice was not an accident of time. It was the product of human nature, dressed in robes of faith, cloaked in the language of law, sanctified by the cries of the crowd. We tell ourselves today that justice means fairness, mercy, protection. But in the medieval square, justice meant submission. It meant order at any cost. It meant fear that silenced voices, broke bodies, erased dissent. The wheel and the rack were not only devices of pain, they were tools of control. They reminded every man, woman, and child that power was absolute, that truth was whatever authority declared it to be. And this is the most haunting lesson. Justice, when wielded by unchecked hands, ceases to be justice at all. It becomes theater, cruelty, domination. Think of the paradoxes we have walked through. The priest blessing the rack before bones were stretched, the mother bringing her child to watch a thief broken on the wheel, the executioner, hated and needed, sharpening his blade while praying for his soul, the victim confessing to crimes they never committed because pain had torn the truth from their lips. Each paradox shows us not monsters, but people, ordinary people, who accepted cruelty because they believed it was righteous. They believed that suffering cleansed, that agony revealed truth, that silence under torment was proof of guilt. They believed, and in that belief, they made horror sacred. And what of us? Have we left that world behind, or merely disguised it? We no longer gather in squares to cheer the breaking of bones, but we gather on screens to watch humiliation, violence, punishment. We no longer call it torture. We call it interrogation, discipline, deterrence. And still, the same words linger. It is necessary. It keeps us safe. It is justice. Perhaps the Middle Ages were not barbaric. They were simply honest. They displayed openly what we have learned to hide. The scars of medieval torture remain not only in ruins and records, but in our imagination. We are fascinated by it still, by the Iron Maiden in the museum, the wheel in the history book, the whispered tales of witch trials. We shudder, but we also look closer, because deep down, we recognize something in it. A truth about ourselves that we do not want to admit. That cruelty, when given a purpose, becomes acceptable. That suffering, when wrapped in morality, becomes spectacle. That justice, when stripped of mercy, becomes indistinguishable from vengeance. And so, the question lingers like smoke after the pyre. What is justice? Is it the law written on parchment, or the bones broken on the wheel? Is it the voice of reason, or the scream of the condemned? Is it protection for the weak, or power for the strong? The medieval world believed that agony was truth, that blood was evidence, that pain was purity, We condemn them now. But centuries from now, what will our descendants condemn in us? Perhaps that is the true gift of looking into this darkness, not to distance ourselves from it, but to see it reflected, to remember that justice is fragile, that law can be twisted, that cruelty can be made holy. The Middle Ages are gone, but the danger they reveal is eternal. Whenever we accept suffering as necessity, whenever we cheer the pain of others as righteousness, whenever we let fear masquerade as truth, we walk again into that square, we listen again to those screams, we become again the crowd that believed justice was written in agony. The racks are silent now, the wheels stand still, the iron boots are rusted, the collars broken, the pyres cold. But silence does not erase memory. The stones of old squares still whisper, the dungeons still breathe, and the echo they carry is clear. Justice without mercy is no justice at all. It is only cruelty, wearing a mask, waiting for us to forget. And so, we are left with a final, bitter question, one that refuses to fade. If they once believed that pain was justice, what illusions do we cling to now? And when the centuries turn, will our children look back at us as we look at them? Horrified, disbelieving, whispering, how could they have called this justice?